Repository is the brain of the data layer of an app. It handles data from remote and local data sources, decides which data source to prefer, and also this is where data caching policy is decided upon. In the previous part, we've gone over the basic structure of the data layer, and today it's time to start implementing the data layer right from its core, from the NumberTriviaRepository implementation, all the while creating contracts for its dependencies. Hello, welcome to ResoCoder, where you are getting prepared for real app development by building better, faster, more stable apps. So subscribe and hit the bell if you want to grow your coding skills. You know, interfaces, abstract classes, it doesn't really matter how you call it. What's important is that those things define contracts. And we already have a contract which the repository implementation must fulfill, and that contract is located inside the domain layer. Every repository needs to have getConcreteNumberTrivia and getRandomNumberTrivia methods. This way, the use cases communicating with this repository don't have to really think about how it operates, they just know it has to fulfill this contract. And be sure to check out the written tutorial from the link in the description, where you can find all of the code written in this video and go through all of the explanation at your own pace. Now that we have the model in place from the previous part, let's finally create the repository implementation class, or at least we are going to start creating it in this part. It will live under the repositories folder of the data layer. So let's create a new file there. It's gonna be called NumberTriviaRepository IMPL for implementation. .dart, of course, and this will be a class NumberTrivia repository implementation, which will implement NumberTrivia repository. So that's the abstract class. So let's import NumberTrivia repository over here. And for now, we're just going to use VS Code to create two missing overrides, which are for the getConcreteNumberTrivia and getRandomNumberTrivia. And even though I am at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I will say it again. The repository needs lower level data sources to get the actual data from them. Similar to how we first created a contract for the repository and we used exclusively that contract, we mocked it in the tests for the use cases, we are similarly going to create only the contracts for the data sources and mock them while testing the repository. But the question is, are data sources enough? Because after all, we will cache the latest NumberTrivia locally to make sure that the user sees something even when he's offline. And to decide whether we want to get some live data from the remote API or we should just get the cached data, we are also going to have a way to find out about the current state of the network connection. And since we want to keep our code as independent from the outside world as possible, we aren't just going to plug any third-party library for connectivity right inside the repository. No, we're going to abstract even that simple network connectivity check into a separate network info class. So before creating the contracts for the data sources, remote and local, let's first create this network info contract. It will go under the core platform folder, which we are going to create right now. That's because this can be shared across multiple features, so it needs to go into the core folder, because checking for connectivity is something which is really not exclusive to the NumberTrivia feature. And it's inside the platform folder because it deals with the underlying platform, of course. On Android, the process of getting network info can be different than on iOS. But of course, we are going to use a library which will just streamline this process into just one method call. But should you not use a connectivity library and you would implement it yourself, you would have probably a bit different code for each platform. So that's why it goes over here to the platform folder. Let's create a new file, networkinfo.dart. And it's going to have just really simple abstract class, because remember, we are just creating contracts in this part. Network info. And inside of here, we are going to have one future bool returning method, or actually it's gonna be a getter, but basically getters are also just methods when it comes to how they are implemented. So isConnected will be its name. Now let's move on to the remote data source. The public interface for this remote data source, which will be called NumberTrivia remote data source, will be almost identical to the interface of the repository, meaning that it will also have getConcrete NumberTrivia and getRandom NumberTrivia methods, but the difference will be in the return types. It's not going to return future either of failure or NumberTrivia, but instead it's just going to return a simple future containing NumberTrivia model, and it's not going to be dealing with failures. Instead, it's going to throw exceptions as any regular old Dart code. We're doing this because the remote data source is at the total boundary between our own app code and the outside world of third-party libraries and APIs. So that's why it's going to throw exceptions, and then it will be the job of the repository to catch those exceptions and to convert them into failures. So let's go ahead, and without any further ado, we are going to create a new file under data sources. Let's call it NumberTrivia remote data source. .dart. And inside here, we're going to have an abstract class called NumberTrivia remote data source. I know those names are long, but it's still better to have expressive long names than short names which don't really tell you much. So NumberTrivia remote data source. And this thing, we can actually copy the methods from the repositories abstract class, and we can just plug them in here after I hide the sidebar because it's getting in the way. So after we paste them in here, we're going to make them return only NumberTrivia model without the failure. So let's import NumberTrivia model here. And the similar thing will happen for the getRandom NumberTrivia. So future NumberTrivia model is returned. And let's actually also add some documentation over here. I'm just going to copy and paste it from the written tutorial, to which you can get from the link in the video description if you want to learn at your own pace and also get all of the code. So just a quick documentation here. Documentation in Dart is, by the way, created by using 3 slashes. So this will call the number endpoint for the concrete number, and it will throw a server exception for all error codes. So for example, when usually the successful OK code is 200 for the response, but you all know probably that 404 means not found. So when the response code will be 404 not found, we're going to throw a server exception from this getConcrete NumberTrivia method. And a similar thing will happen for getRandom NumberTrivia. The thing is, we currently do not have any server exception, so let's create it right now in order to use it later on in the tests of the repository. So we are going to create exceptions inside a new file under the error folder. We're just going to call it exceptions.dart. And some people have been asking me whether or not we should pluralize this or make it a singular, so exception instead of exceptions. It doesn't really matter. Like those naming conventions, they can go out of the window. What's really important with this architecture is that you have independent layers, and as long as you follow that, the naming conventions are completely irrelevant. Actually, in the blog posts, I probably use the singular version, so exception, whereas in this video I am using exceptions, but that doesn't really matter. Don't let that confuse you. So anyway, we want to have a class server exception here, which will extend exception, or actually should implement exception so that we do not have this error saying that there should be some generative constructor. It doesn't really need to be extending exception, it can be only implementing an exception. And similarly, let's just, while we are at this, create a cache exception, which, as you can probably tell, will be thrown from within the local data source whenever some cache error happens. So cache exception goes right over here. And of course, we are keeping this simple by not having any fields inside these exceptions. But of course, you can, in your own projects, create a field final message or string message if you want to convey some more information about the exception. So something like this. We're keeping it simple, so we are not going to have any messages passed around inside the exceptions. And while we are dealing with these kind of errors, let's also create failures, because remember that the repository will catch these exceptions and it will transform them into failures, and then they will be returned using the either type, more precisely as the left side of the either type. So because of that, usually failures map exactly one-to-one to exceptions. So let's just copy these exceptions. Let's go to failures.dart. Let's comment in that these are some general failures. And we're going to have two of them here. So this one will be server failure. The bottom one will be cache failure. And they will both implement failure. Or actually, these ones can actually extend failure, because now when we implement it just without extending, we're going to be missing concrete implementation of getter equatable.props, because we are extending equatable for simplifying value equality should these subclasses contain some fields. All right, so let's get to the local data source, which will be the next data source apart from the NumberTrivia remote data source. Up until now, we've been always dealing about getting data, whether the entity inside the repository or the model inside this remote data source. And this data which we've been getting was always split into concrete and random NumberTrivia. But this will all change with the NumberTrivia local data source. Why? Well, because it's a local data source dealing with the local cache, we will also need to get data into the cache and not only get it out of there. And also, we're not gonna care whether we are dealing with the concrete or random NumberTrivia, because the caching policy, which will be implemented inside the repository here in the next lesson, the caching policy will be very simple. That is always to cache and retrieve the last trivia gotten from the remote data source. So whenever we have internet connection, we are always going to cache the lastly gotten trivia locally. So let's go ahead and create a new file under data sources, NumberTrivia local data source. .dart. So it's going to be abstract class, NumberTrivia local data source, which will have again two methods, but this time they will be a bit different as I've already outlined. So the first one will be for getting, but not concrete or random, but just for the last NumberTrivia. So it will return NumberTrivia model, because even the local cache will operate with JSON, because we are going to store a JSON string inside shared preferences in later parts. So this will be called get last NumberTrivia. and let's import number trivia model here. And then also we're going to have future void returning method. So basically it's just void, but it operates with futures so that you can await until it has completely run. Let's call it cache number trivia. And it's going to get number trivia model instance trivia to cache. All right, I am again going to paste the documentation for the first method in here. So this will get the cached number trivia model, which was gotten the last time the user had an internet connection. And in an instance where there is no cache data present, it's going to throw no local data exception, which should actually be called cache exception, because I have renamed it prior to recording this tutorial series. So it's going to throw cache exception if there is no cached data present. And over here you can see why it's not cool to use only some written documentation as the only documentation for your code, because it gets out of sync pretty quickly. Whereas if you document your code with tests, as we are doing usually, the tests are not gonna get out of sync that easily, because if they get too out of sync, they will simply fail and you will have to check out what's going on in those tests, fix them, fix your code, get those tests to pass, and that way you will really never have the test documentation go out of sync. And also notice that neither of the data sources, whether the local or remote data source, contains code which seems to be dependent on some outer layer of the app. For example, the URL of the API will of course have to be a string, yet we get a number as an integer into the getConcreteNumberTrivia method. And also in the local data source, even though we already know that we are going to use shared preferences to implement it, nowhere in here is a mention to something specific to shared preferences or any such things. And also I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, but shared preferences work synchronously, yet we have these futures everywhere. So that's because usually some local cache, for example, Sambast, about which you can check out the tutorial from the card in the corner, works asynchronously. And even though the caching system which we are going to use is not asynchronous, we still pretend like it is. So we are really trying to not get entangled in the intricacies of the outer third-party classes which we are going to be using within these data sources. And this coding practice allows you to really easily swap these low-level packages. For example, in the remote data source, we're going to be using the HTTP package, but with this coding practice of really keeping our code package agnostic, we would be able to swap the HTTP package to something like Chopper very easily without much effort. And if you want to learn about Chopper, which is something like retrofit for Flutter and Dart, you can check out the tutorial from the card in the corner. So let's finally set up the repository, because currently it doesn't have anything very useful in it. It just contains these two not implemented methods coming from its contract. While we are not going to write any actual logic in this part, that's coming in the next one, so definitely stay tuned and subscribe to this channel if you do not want to miss it. We will at least set this repository up to work with all its dependencies we have already created in this part. And since we are doing test-driven development, we will also prepare the test file for the next part. So let's actually create the test right now. It will again be a mirrored image of the lib folder. So we want to go over to test, then mirror the implementation file. So we want to go to data, new folder repositories, and now new file within the repositories test folder. It will be called NumberTriviaRepository IMPL test. .dart, of course. And let me just steal some of the imports from some other test file, for example, from this getConcreteNumberTrivia test, because we again need Mockito, and Flutter test. And we know that the repository should take in all of the classes which we have created in this part. So that is the remote and local data sources, and also the network info object. Because we are inside a test file, which we are preparing for the next part, let's create mocks for all of these dependencies right off the bat. So class, the first one will be mock remote data source. It will extend mock, and it will implement number trivia remote data source. All right, so let's import everything we need. Now let's copy this, and down here we are going to have mock local data source, which will implement NumberTrivia local data source. And finally, we are going to have mock network info. So let's again paste that below. Oh, so mock network info extends mock and implements network info. So let's import that. And now once we have all of these mocks in place, we're just going to set up the main method of this test for the future part. So what do we want to have here? NumberTriviaRepository should be inside this test. Or actually its implementation. So this will be called repository. And let's import this class. And then we are going to have all of the mock instances in here. So mock remote data source, we're going to call it mock remote data source. Then mock local data source will be called mock local data source with a surprise. And finally, mock network info will be called how else than mock network info. So now inside the setup method for this test, we are going to set it up so that the mock remote data source will be equal to a new instance of mock remote data source. Similar thing will happen with the local. So mock local is equal to mock local data source. And finally, the mock network info is equal to mock network info. All right, and the last step in here will be that the repository should be equal to NumberTriviaRepository IMPL, which should be able to take in all of these three dependencies. So they will be done as named parameters. So remote data source should take in the mock remote data source, not local. But of course, it does not work because currently there are just no such parameters inside the constructor for the repository. But let's actually finish up. So this will be local data source, should take in mock local data source, and finally this will take in the mock network info called network info. All right, and now it's not really a test, but it would definitely not even compile because these arguments cannot be taken into the repository's constructor. So let's go ahead and add all of the needed fields and constructor parameters over to the NumberTrivia repository. So let's create a final NumberTrivia remote data source, and we are just going to copy those names from within the test file because they are pretty long here. So final NumberTrivia remote data source, then similarly NumberTrivia local data source, it will be called local data source. And finally, we are going to have final network info called network info. Let's import everything we need here. So all of the classes will get imported. Let's fix the imports so that they are relative, not absolute. Now let's hit Control and dot to create constructor for final fields, at least within VS Code. And what we want to have here is that the constructor will not have them as required unnamed parameters, but instead we want to have required named parameters. So let's put the add required annotation everywhere, and we need to import meta. So let's go ahead and do that. Meta.dart will be imported, and now this required annotation will be present before each and every parameter. And now if we take a look at the NumberTriviaRepository implementation test, it does not pass because we are not really testing anything yet. That will come in the next part, but surely we can now create the NumberTriviaRepository implementation with all of its needed dependencies, which is definitely a good sign. To go through this tutorial once again at your own pace and also to get all of the code in one place, check out the written tutorial available from the link in the video description on resocoder.com. So there's already quite a lot to digest from this part because we have created 3 contracts for the repository's dependencies, namely the remote data source, local data source, and also network info. And because we always implement things from the inner parts outwards, in the next part we are gonna implement the repository. And then only later on are we going to implement these data sources and network info. And if you do not want to miss the next part and also more tutorials like this, definitely subscribe to this channel and also join the notification squad by hitting the bell button to make sure you grow your Flutter coding skills, because here on ResoCoder I am determined to provide you with the best app development tutorials and resources out there. If this video helped you with creating the contracts for the dependencies of the repository, and overall if it moves you a bit more toward understanding clean architecture, give this video a like and also share it with other developers who will surely benefit from it too. Leave a comment if you have anything to say, any questions or suggestions. Follow me on Instagram, I go under the name ResoCoder everywhere, and see you in the next video.